What's a rule that was implemented somewhere that massively backfired? Also, the infamous Barbados vs Grenada soccer match point. The organizers of the 1994 Caribbean Tournament Cup had a rather odd change to the rules for extra time. If a game was still drawn at full time, it would go to extra time, but the first goal scored would win. This is perfectly normal, the golden goal rule. What was different is that they ruled that winning this way would count as having won by 2 goals for the purpose of tournament qualification, instead of just 1. Barbados went into a match against Grenada needing 2 goals to qualify for the main tournament. If they lost or won by only 1 goal, Grenada would qualify instead. Under the regular rule, this would mean that if the match went to extra time, there would basically be no point Barbados playing, because even if they scored, they would only win by 1 goal and not qualify. But the 2-point rule would motivate them to play on. Sound good? Well, you might be able to guess what happened. The match looked like it was about to end with Barbados 2-1 Grenada, a win for Barbados, but not the 2 goals they needed. So Barbados deliberately scored an own goal in the last few minutes of the match, making the score 2-2, hoping to trigger extra time and a chance to score the magic 2 value goal point. The Grenada players quickly realized they could do the same, score an own goal to make the match 3-2 to Barbados, which would have Barbados winning by only 1 goal. So Grenada would qualify. But the Barbados players realized that too, and so they began to defend Grenada's goal points. So for the last 7 minutes of the match, Grenada were trying to score a goal in either net, since scoring a goal against Barbados would give them 3-2, and they would win the match, and scoring in their own goal would make it 3-2 to Barbados, so they would lose the match but win the qualification, and Barbados were defending both point. Amazingly, Barbados did actually manage to do so, successfully defending themselves, while half of their team were defending Grenada's goal against Grenada, and then scored the golden goal in extra time and qualified. Worked for a warehouse 4 days a week, 11 AM 9:30 PM Monday to Thursday. They reiterated many times during the interview process that overtime was optional. My first day my supervisor told me that overtime is indeed optional, but if you don't stay for overtime then everybody else has to stay even later. So if you do leave on time, don't come back. Whatever. I didn't mind the extra hours too much, although a 10.5-hour shift is already long, but the bonus was that we could go early if all the orders were done. As you can imagine, the good workers busted their ass from start to finish, cutting as many corners, good and bad ones, as they could, in order to get out early. Normally this ended up with us being able to leave around 15 minutes early, or on a really good day where the stars aligned, everybody showed up, we could leave as early as 7:30 or 8. However, leaving that early only happened once, or twice a year at most. Overtime was every week. Every single Monday we would work until 2 AM 11 AM to 2 AM isn't ideal when you have no idea when you're off. At around 7 PM we'd start to get an idea if we are in for another hour or another 6. One of the genius new hires mentioned to the boss in the office how he was hoping to get out by 6. Oh good. Apparently the boss was thinking us leaving early was a common occurrence now and decided that nobody was going to be leaving early anymore. Sweep or dust, or whatever, but nobody leaves until 9:30. All of a sudden we were late every single day without fail. Why? We were working hours off to get out early, but failing every day, and ending up on time, or still late. By taking away our ability to leave early, everybody gave up working hard. Slow down. We've got another hour left anyways. I'm not sweeping. Went from about 45 hours a week to 55, 13 hours every day. Nobody ever left early anymore, but nobody left on time either. Losses for everybody involved, because the boss didn't realize that us leaving early for 2 days out of a year actually gave us the daily motivation to work hours off the other 360. Our boss put a stop to leaving early. No incentive to work hours off anymore means paying overtime every day. I worked at a call center, and whenever someone called customer attention to cancel their service you would lose a point. If you could not talk them out of it, the people with the least points got more hours. So whenever people called with a legit excuse, like I'm moving the phone, agents would hassle the caller to try and make them stay or give them the runaround, so they would get frustrated and just give up. Once I was on the phone with a lady and she wanted to cancel her service. I asked her why, and she said it was for my mother, and she has died. I gave her absolutely no pressure to stay or change her mind. She sounded like she was having a hard enough time as it is. After the call ended, I got a message from a supervisor that had been listening to my call. They randomly listen to our calls from time to time, and he wanted to know why I did not try and get her to stay with them. I said the service was not for her, it was for her mother, and she died. His response was the most heartless thing I have ever heard. You should have made her send us proof of death. That can take over a month to do, and that's another bill for us. Or try to convince her to keep the service in memory of her mother. It's all about delaying the customer until after their next bill. After my shift was over, I gave them my 2 weeks notice, and as a final dick move they changed my schedule for both weeks. I told my boss I had made a mistake, took back my letter saying I would still come in for the next 2 weeks, and left and never came back. Edit 1. Their system actually requires no proof or actual reason to stop a customer service. It even says in their contract that they can stop service at any time. They were only doing this to be a dick and charge the customer more money. Edit 2. This took place in Canada. Edit 3. This took place at a call center that outsources calls to over 200 businesses in the United States. Strip joints in Alberta, Canada are an interesting example of this, believing that strippers and strip clubs were the root of all things wrong with the world. The Citizens for Decency, led by Audrey Jensen, sprung about in Alberta in the 1980s. They pushed for legislation that would create an invisible, imaginary buffer zone of 1.5 meters or something around exotic dancers to protect them from patrons in Pervs Row. This barrier would become facilitated in some clubs with an odd little railing or other physical means, but most bars I've seen in Alberta don't have actual physical barriers. At least not anymore. Maybe there were more intrusive blocks and partitions when the law was new. The result of this protective measure was instantly that patrons can no longer hand $5 bills, 20s, ECT to the dancers. They cannot tuck a bill into their undies or crawl on stage with a bill in their mouth to have it snatched away. Instead, in Alberta, strip club patrons throw dollar coins at the dancers. Typically this comes after their dance, when the dancers go around posing on their knees, ECT with their personal posters rolled up to improvise a cone. Customers throw their loonies at the cone, and then it's funneled toward her bussy. Other versions of this is the dancers will lick a loony and stick it to theirs, and the game is to throw your loonies to try to knock it off. Winners get a fridge magnet, signed poster, keychain, etc. Once the coin toss games are over, the dancer will then return to the stage with a large magnet on a leash and drag it around, collecting her hard-earned metal. She'll intermittently scrape the loonies into a beer jug as they accumulate and continue dragging the magnet around. I should say that some folks still prefer to keep it classy and use larger bills, but it's about 1 in 20 points. So, to recap, the goal was to protect the safety and dignity of dancers. The result is the dancers have become reduced to flashy coin toss targets. TLDR. In Alberta, strip clubs are weird, and you throw dollar coins at the strippers. Edit. Wow, my first gilding. Thanks, kind stranger. The beach club I worked as a cabana boy at decided one summer to buy $40,000 worth of club umbrellas. The old system was that you as a cabana boy had 30 to 60 families who you took care of in exchange for tips. One of your responsibilities was to carry whatever heavy beach equipment they bought, Tommy Bahama chairs and umbrellas, from the cabana to the ocean and set it up, and then carry it back up to the cabana at the end of the day. If you left chairs or umbrellas on the beach, the club supervisors would charge you $1 per item, because they would have to carry it to avoid the stuff from getting washed away, broken or stolen by locals. It was a pretty fair and workable system. The new system was that members still had their own chairs, but would request a number of umbrellas from the cabana boy. Obviously, they requested way more than they would ever need to all by themselves, and the club umbrellas were extra heavy and exhausting to set up. We complained to management about this, and a lot of other stuff, but they basically just said fuck you to us. Well, that didn't exactly inspire us to do them any favors. Considering most of our pay came from the members, since all the umbrellas looked the same, we would just take the chairs and leave the umbrellas on the beach and no one would know who was supposed to be responsible for picking them up. The supervisors simply couldn't get them all, and almost all of them wound up broken or missing by the end of the summer. Whoops TLDR. Beach Club got new equipment that caused a lot of extra work without giving us any additional compensation or tools to deal with the work. All the new equipment ended up getting trashed. At the company I used to work for, we had a couple big trade shows per year that we went to, where most of the staff attended. For a long time, the rule was that you could be reimbursed up to $30 per day for meals. You just had to turn in receipts afterward. Well, inevitably somebody, let's call him Mike, since that was his name, decided that he would spend his per diem every day for a week on cocktails and turn those receipts in. He got reimbursed, but there was a new policy implemented. From there on out, you could only submit 2 drinks per day for reimbursement. I think you can probably figure out where this is going. Some fought the rule by simply going to dinner late, getting their check before the clock struck midnight, then opening a new tab, allowing them to have more than 2 drinks on the company in a single sitting. But that was for amateurs, since the rules didn't specify your receipts had to be from some kind of restaurant, as people would often go to the grocery store to buy snacks, protein bars to nosh on during the day if they couldn't grab a lunch, and whatnot. Turns out that you can get 2 big 1.75L plastic bottles of bottom shelf liquor at the store and order off the value menu at the McDonald's drive-thru for less than $30. Alcoholism intensifies. When I was in middle school, a girl in my class fell down the stairs and broke her arm. She was one of those girls who was always somehow sick or hurt, so I didn't believe her, but most of the administration freaked the fuck out about it. Their theory was that the fall was due to too much aggression in the hallways and on the stairs. There were probably 150 kids in my middle school and only 2 sets of stairs. We were all in the 2nd floor of one building. It was very crowded. As soon as the bell rang, everyone would run out and flood the hallways and try to push and shove their way to their next class as violently as they had to. It was Catholic school, so we were penalized if we were late, and they were pretty strict about it. Anyway, for some reason they actually thought that if they put a red piece of tape down the length of the hallway, everything would be fixed. They designated one set of stairs for going up and the other for going down. One side of the line went one way, the other went the opposite way, like it was a road and we were cars. If your classroom was 4 steps away or directly across the hall, you couldn't just walk to it. You had to go all the way around the line, with all 149 of the other middle schoolers trying to push and shove their way in front of you or around you. We weren't even allowed to step on the line. We could get written up for that. They called that getting an infraction. It was the same penalty if we were late to class. Obviously, this backfired pretty severely. Not only did TARDIS skyrocket, I'm pretty sure there were more injuries as we frantically pushed at each other. The line was mercilessly ridiculed. People would push their friends onto it, so they would get in trouble for touching it, or push them across the hall, so they were forced to circle the perimeter again to get to class. Eventually, the boys started riots, or protests where they'd gather in the hallways and push through in a straight line, forcing traffic to all go one direction, line or no. One day, we had a planned protests and started running zigzags over the line and up the downstairs and down the upstairs. We got in trouble of course, and some kids got hurt, but participating in that was a lot of fun. That was right before spring break, and when we came back, the line was gone. I guess they finally realized that it was a bad and potentially dangerous idea. In NJ, my high school banned cell phones one year. It was the early 2000s, so there weren't iPhones yet. They were just disruptive texting devices and our principal hated them. They weren't allowed anywhere inside the building. You couldn't even keep them in your backpack or locker in case of emergency. About a week into his new rule, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center, where many of the students' parents commuted to work. Without their cell phones, every worried student had to nervously wait around for hours to use one of the 2 phones the school office had just to check if their parents were alive. Nor could those parents reach their children in that time of crisis. The cell phone ban was lifted the next day. Our principal was still kinda pissy about it, so he banned them again at the beginning of that next year. On the exact same day, 1 year later, an old rotting tree in the front of the school decided to break apart and fall on top of a group of students, injuring a handful and killing one. This time the panic was reversed as parents were flooding the school's phone line, unable to reach their children directly, trying to find out if their kids were hurt. The news had reported the story live before our school made any calls to parents, and they didn't report any names. So of course there was mass panic. That ban was lifted again that next day. He didn't tempt fate again after that. Punishing me for not taking my lunch. This was in Utah, one of the states out there that doesn't even require you to give your employees lunches, so this makes it even more absurd. The problem was they didn't want to cross-train others who were there to cover my role of loading up trucks with gasoline product. So I was busy as hell, no stop with no backup, and often didn't even have time to stop for lunch, or I'd get put back to work about 20 minutes into lunch. All of a sudden one day, because they are looking at causes of overtime and how to cut down on not spent, I find my time card for the pay period has been cut back to reflect all these hour lunches I never got. I raised big hell about this, pointed out it was illegal. They tell me there is no reason I can't take an hour lunch every day. They regretted it when I'd lock myself up in my little outside shack for an hour and refuse to open it or come out regardless of what trucks showed up if I was already on lunch. And once that became a big issue, I simply just left and stayed gone for an hour and refused to answer my phone. About several months into getting sick of ignoring my phone for a whole hour, I found it to be a great source of amusement answering it and telling them, sure, hang tight, I'm heading back into work right now. And then I would proceed to sit there and not bother returning to the property until an hour lunch was damn well over, while they all waited eagerly thinking I was on my way back right now. In college, I worked at a department store. I was a pretty good employee. I always showed up on time, never called off. I always did the right thing. I folded and cleaned, while others just loaded around, disappeared or goofed off. I didn't ask for crazy accommodations with my schedule point, so some sort of formal rolls around. I request off that Saturday and Sunday. Saturday was to attend. Sunday was to recover. I was informed that there was a new policy and sales associates could no longer request off 2 days in a row. I was not guaranteed either. They would not give me a decision. I just had to wait till the schedule came out. I got the schedule. I was on it till 4 on Saturday and open to close on Sunday. I worked that Saturday till 4, but wasn't happy about it and decided that they needed me more than I needed them. So if I woke up feeling good enough to go into work on Sunday, I would. If I didn't, I wouldn't. I didn't feel good Sunday morning, so I stayed in bed. I got a call from the manager shortly before shift. The manager wanted to know where I was and when I would be there. Then she emotionally unloaded on me. Then I told her she could enjoy covering for me for the rest of the week, because not only was I not coming in for this shift that I had requested not to work, but I would also not be coming in for my remaining shifts. I was in high school in the 1990s and early 2000s, and short shorts were fairly popular at the time for the girls. It seemed like an arms race to see who could wear them the shortest without getting in trouble. When I started, the rule was vague and hard to define. Basically must be longer than the cheerleader skirts, but those were really short, and how do you compare that accurately to what someone has on? So some genius thought, fingertip length. When standing up, the shorts must be at least as long as your middle finger as you held your hands by your side. A little side note: early on in high school, one of the teachers got a little too handsy with a student and got in massive trouble. His hand was on her lower back while talking to her despite her trying to get away. After this, teachers refrained from touching students unless it was a hug the student initiated. So girls would get called out, hold their hands at their sides, but they learned that if they didn't have their arms firmly against their body and not quite straight, they could easily have their hands an inch or more higher on their legs. And since teachers didn't want to touch the girls, they couldn't ensure arms were straight. Also, some people just have short arms, and no matter what, they could wear some really short shorts/skirts as a result. For a few years, shorts and skirts actually got shorter than they were before the rule was implemented. By junior year, they settled on shorts/skirts must be at least 5 inches from the middle of the kneecap. Of course this wasn't fair, because 5 inches on a 5-foot flat girl looked really different than 5 inches on a 6-foot tall girl, but at least the staff could claim they were using the same metric across the board. I visited a teacher after school hours when I was in college because I had a physics question, and I'll just say it appears they had given up entirely because the shorts I saw then were far shorter than anything that existed when I went to school there. No, really a rule, but more a bureaucratic mistake, but a good story nonetheless. So as a bit of background, in Dutch high schools, you have school exams, SEs, which the school can produce freely, and a central exam, SE, which is a national test. The combined grades of a subject's SE and SEs give you a final grade, which shows if you passed high school for that grade or not. So SEs are basically super important tests, because they will partly determine if you pass high school or not. At the beginning of the school year, you get a summary of every SE you will have that year, including 10 things you need to learn to make them, chapters in textbooks, etc., and any tools you get to do them, calculators and such. So my grade had an English SE and we were all studying vocabulary lists, as was required. But one day, a week or two before the SE, a girl in our grade noticed that in the summary, the tools and study material for the SE were switched up by mistake. It said that you needed to study no tools, and tools at your disposal were vocabulary lists AF. She announced it to the faculty only a short time before the SE, but because the SE and everything surrounding it couldn't be changed because of regulations, the students could just make their tests with vocabulary sheets. Needless to say, everyone passed the SE. TLDR, the school accidentally forced themselves to give us an answer sheet to use during a very important test. The Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act. Congress implemented this federal law as a means to protect the wild horse population, because wild horses represent the free spirit of the West Point. As it turns out, horses are exotic to our current ecosystem. Horses existed here 13,000 years ago, but were wiped out, and the North American ecosystems have changed to make do without them. They weren't reintroduced until the Spanish expeditions in the 1600s, where a few horses managed to escape captivity. They are also highly invasive. They damage every ecosystem that they are a part of and utterly kill biodiversity. They also reproduce at a rate of 20% annually, which is huge for a species whose mares can only produce one offspring per breeding season. This high rate of reproduction is mainly due to a lack of natural predation. I mean, within 6 years of passing the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act, horse populations tripled, and they continue to grow. Since they are protected, we can't really do anything with them. We can't kill them, and we can't sell them to be killed. So, to control the population, BLM basically rounds up the excess and ships them to facilities where they are cared for until they die. This process costs us millions every year. BLM's budget for 2018 set aside $70 million just for horses, and that doesn't include the cost of these horse care facilities. On a side note, it's kinda funny actually, because President Trump proposed that we sell these horses to countries that would be able to eat them or use them in some way, since we can't, as a means of cutting back on costs associated with horse care and even subsidize our capture efforts a bit. Well, of course the headlines then read Trump wants to mass slaughter the wild horses or something along those lines, which naturally drives public opinion against the idea, even though it seems like a fairly common sense thing to do. To be fair though, in order for that proposal to be legal, we'd have to abolish this act, which I'm perfectly okay with. In 8th grade, we had a computer class with a teacher who was pretty rude. My friend and I did not take well to his demeanor, and he was a new teacher as well. It wasn't long after our first week of school we figured out he was a real dick. My friend is a homosexual and this teacher would give him a hard time, so guess what? We gave this for a year to remember from taping the laser under his computer mouse before class, so he'd spend 10 minutes looking to make sure the connection was right, to spit wads, to making drawings and jokes about him, because that's 8th grade us were doing retaliation. One day he decided to revoke our internet privileges on our specified computers, and we were in charge of the school web page. Then he'd lower our grade, since we weren't allowed access to our schoolwork. What did this do? Give us more time to think of revenge plots. This included putting on our clunky school earphones with them not connected, so he'd scream at us no music, then we'd hold up the unconnected end of the plug and smile. He eventually got so fed up with us, he'd send us out to the hall every single day during class, so he wouldn't have to deal with us. Buttt, he sent us out in chairs that have wheels. So every day from that point on, instead of having a computer class, we had a race down the hallway in rolling chairs class. It was hilarious. By this point, multiple kids were purposely getting sent out of class every day to join the rally chair races. It was a year full of wins, losses, and triumph. The teacher didn't even give enough sheet to stop us. He would literally watch us flying and spinning down the hallways at top speed through his classroom window. He would just shake his head, probably pondering his own existence at this point, hoping maybe one or all of us would fall to our own demise. Every single rule this teacher implemented completely backfired. Needless to say, he wasn't a teacher for very long. Well, I'm late, but I don't see the Four Pests campaign and the top replies, which is surprising, because it's a program that backfired so badly that millions of people died. So basically Mao Zedong decided that 4 animals in China needed to go: mosquitoes, rats, flies, and sparrows. Mosquitoes and rats spread diseases, so they gotta go. Flies are annoying, so they also gotta go. Sparrows were eating farmers' grain, so they gotta go. At the time, being seen as anything less than a dehead Communist Party supporter meant you could be targeted for harassment or even killed in the streets by Red Guards. So everyone in China enthusiastically participated in this mass murder of creatures. 3 million people turned out at once to kill sparrows in Beijing. Unfortunately, most peasants in China couldn't tell a sparrow from any other kind of bird, so they killed pretty much anything that could fly. As predicted, the bird population in China plummeted. Who could have foreseen what happened next? Well, everyone. Birds don't just eat grain occasionally, they also eat bugs. Specifically, locusts, which China has an awful lot of. With a significant decrease in natural predators, locusts swarmed the fields and essentially destroyed the harvests of Chinese farms around the country. By this time, Mao realized he faked up and changed the 4th pest from sparrows to bedbugs, but changing your mind doesn't bring birds back to life suddenly. Yada yada yada. 25 to 45 million people starved to death. 3 years ago, while working at a large resort in our GM decided to stop hiring the outside company we used for Christmas decorations, and instead made all of us managers sign up for multiple 2-hour blocks to decorate. Since most of our decorations we owned in-house, well, we were a lodge-style resort with rafters all over. This meant fluffing and decorating multiple trees for our 30,000 square feet of meeting space, and hanging the icicle lights with a staple gun on every stupid bullshit rafter. Nobody wanted to do this, not even the engineering crew. We all had so much to do in this period, like preparing for banquets and holiday parties each night, sales coordinating these, front desk crazy busy, etc. So we all decorated. Nobody said how well it needed to look. The front desk manager staple gunned his thumb. Had to be out. Took twice the time to check people in when he was on desk. The sales department decorated trees on only the facing sides, and awfully I might add. So sparse on ornaments it looked like a tree decorated in a halfway house. People found these old Peanuts Christmas decorations from probably 20 years ago in the basement that were unanimously decided to be placed all over for Diamond Resort with Snoopy and Charlie Brown all over. Haha. The one thing I did that was cool was I made a wine rack advent calendar. I told them I gifted a cheap bottle of wine each night to a random guest who had a pretty high check. But I tried it once, and the guest was weirded out and thought I was faking with them, so I just gave them out to my friends at home. Needless to say, GM was furious and couldn't discipline everyone, so we hired the company back and everyone gloomily went back to their normal jobs. This is probably best intended for r/malicious compliance, but hope I wasn't too late to the thread for people to enjoy this anecdote. Several years back I managed a group of 6 people, 2 of whom were women. Coincidentally, they both ended up pregnant at the same time point. When the day comes, and they both leave on 20 weeks of maternity leave, I find out that not only do I have to hold their jobs for them, but I can't have any even temporary replacements, because as far as the company was concerned, I was fully staffed. We were just expected to suck up the work 1/3 of the team was no longer doing. When annual review time came around, I was told my team was underperforming. The fact that we were understaffed by 1/3 was understood, but the review system didn't allow that to be taken into consideration, so we all got faked on raises and bonuses. The best part is I found out that women on maternity leave automatically got 5 out of 5 performance reviews, because it wouldn't be fair to rate them while they're on leave, so the women not working got significantly better bonuses than the men who were doing their work for them. Point at the end of the 2 girls' leave, one just said I'm not coming back. She'd just wanted to stretch out her benefits coverage as long as possible. The other one did come back to work and announced that she was already pregnant again, which I didn't even think was possible. So a few months later we were saying goodbye to her again for another 20 weeks. The guys who had to pick up the slack very much resented the whole situation and to quit for other jobs over it. At one point the team was down to 2 people, the rest having quit or on leave. One of my previous jobs, a co-worker told me a story about how he trusted the Wrong Fatch when he was way out in the sticks and about 100 miles from his house delivering office products. There were no drivers in the area to relieve him. So he stopped at a gas station bathroom and tried to clean up as best he could. His boxes were a total loss, of course, but he had still gotten enough on his pants for the smell to be obvious within conversational range. But he still had a full van route to run. So instead of entering the customer business, saying hi, and getting a signature, he decided to just slide the product as far into the lobby as he could from the front door, say hey, how y'all doing? Y'all have a good one, and then signed the proof of delivery as left at door. For 35 customers. So of course, a few of those customers called in on him asking what the hell was going on. Some of those calls made it to the owner of the business. So the owner called the driver and asked the driver to explain himself, which the driver did in full. He asked the driver if he had called in the issue to dispatch, and the driver had, adding that dispatch had signed off on his plan. So after he got off the call with the driver, he walked to the dispatch office and asked the dispatcher if the driver had called in his dilemma. The dispatcher confirmed that the driver had indeed called it in and that they authorized him to leave the orders at the customer's doors. Naturally, this made the owner mad, at which point he yelled, "Red-faced new rule, if a driver sheets his pants, he goes home. I don't care where he is or what's left of his route. We can't have drivers going around smelling like shit. It's bad for business." Fast forward 3 months. Our shippers' trucks are late. I had just gotten back from a very early route. I had to help put out fires all over the warehouse due to the late trucks, and then get drivers loaded and out the door before I had to load up and run a second route of my own because another driver had called out that morning. It was shaping up to be a horrible day at an already horrible job and I wanted no part of it. So instead of running around like an underpaid chicken with my head cut off, I simply recalled what my co-worker told me about rule #1 regarding number 2 and sheet my pants in front of the dispatcher. He had to send me home because it was in the rules, and I got a free day off. This isn't a famous example, rather something from my own personal experience. I work in a preschool, and at lunchtime we tried to implement a rule where the children don't eat their dessert first. Seems reasonable, right? Except every day we spend debating with 3 to 5-year-olds exactly what is a dessert. Since we don't have hot lunch, it's not universal what the kids eat for lunch. Sometimes kids come with a sandwich and a chocolate. Other kids come with pasta and fruit. Others come with just pretzels, chips, and yogurt. And every day the kids police each other on eating dessert first. So we hear stuff like Jane is eating her dessert first. Except her dessert in this case is yogurt because she had a sandwich in Vegas for her main lunch. But for someone else their main food is the yogurt. The other day I actually argued with a preschooler that his pasta was not dessert, even though it was sweet. He was only eating pretzels and hummus, and refused to eat his pasta, because it was sweet. Therefore his dessert point was basically given up, because it's just turned into a disaster where every day I have kids asking me can they eat their food, because it's all dessert, or just arguing with preschoolers about what is healthy. TLDR, teaching preschoolers how to eat healthy turned into an epic fail of arguments, and tattling on each other over what is a dessert. A large group of women and religious zealots started the Temperance Movement, hoping it would make better men out of our fellow male Americans. Alcohol abuse became a big problem of the late 19th and nascent 20th centuries, so it isn't like this movement was tiny. It involved the Methodists, the Baptists, Mormons, the Temperance Movement, the women's suffrage movement, and all of the other fun-loving groups who pop up every 30 months or so, to rob us of yet another fun way to have fun. Point in the upswell of passing the Universal Suffrage Amendment, 19, a second amendment became law as well, 18. The 18th Amendment passed swiftly and no one pondered the ramifications. Women thought they had won both suffrage and a less drunk society. Men thought they had just made a big step forward into a more sober and happy world. Within 2 years, mobsters in Chicago and New York City had set up an illicit and complex alcohol manufacturing and distribution network. You would have never heard of the name Al Capone if it had not been for the 18th Amendment. Speakeasies rose up across the country, and in most small towns, the prohibition laws were ignored. Moonshine and homemade beer was plentiful everywhere but in the big cities. And even in the big cities, beer was like weed is today. You could obtain it, but it would cost you. Speaking of weed, it is these same groups along with William Randolph Hearst who had banned marijuana just a decade earlier. They love having fun, don't they? Anyways, after 10 years of a massive crime wave sweeping the country followed by a massive economic downturn, FDR campaigned on repealing prohibition. He won in a landslide. The 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. However, due to a long period of beer and liquor being off the market, Americans' tastes had changed. Homemade beer was watered down to spread it out to more people, or over a longer period of time. Same for liquor, so beer that was made afterwards was less strong and less flavorful. If you ever want to blame anyone for the sorry taste of American beer such as Bud Light, etc., look no further than the Temperance Movement and their menagerie of fun-loving, church-going compatriots. My high school had a carpool system, and it's hard to explain over text, but imagine a square campus with the high school in the left, elementary school in the middle and the middle school on the right. Kids in high school would come in from the top and do a kind of U-turn near the end of one side, then leave the way they came in, while the middle school and elementary school would enter in the right side, drop off their kids, then cut through the middle of campus and exit out the top. It worked well and there were no problems, but the school decided to spend about $1 million to have these safety experts come in and find what needed to be fixed, and they came to the conclusion that the carpool is what needed to be fixed. All this build up to say that their new carpool system they implemented had everyone from every school entering in one entrance, and when you drive from the high school section to the middle/elementary school section it goes from 2 lanes to 1. So the first day they implemented it, kids from every school ended up being 30-minutes late because the lines were chaotic and so inflated because there was a huge bottleneck that 3x the amount of people were trying to get through. Our principal announced at 11 AM and basically said yay, that didn't work. Back to the old way tomorrow. TLDR schools spent $1 million and tried to change carpool system. Went back to the old system in 3 hours. It failed so badly. Massachusetts State Assembly pushed a law stripping the governor of the power to appoint a US senator, which later caused the Democrats in the US Senate to lose the supermajority in early 2010, thus changing the political landscape, and Obamacare was formed. In 2004, then Senator John Kerry had the potential to be president, which meant that his seat could have been vacant. With Governor Mitt Romney, that would have meant he could appoint a senator to fill the seat for the remainder of the term. Most likely, he would have chosen a fellow Republican to fill the vacancy. The Senate Assembly then chose to change law, stripping the governor the power to choose a senator and leaving it in the hands of the people through a special election. The presidential election resulted in John Kerry losing to George W. Bush, and that was the end of it, or so we thought. In August 2009, Senator Ted Kennedy died of glioblastoma, a type of brain cancer, leaving his Senate seat vacant. Since there were new laws regarding how senators are appointed, MA had to follow through with having a special election to appoint a new senator. At that time, Obamacare was being formed and pushed through the House, and held the supermajority at exactly 60 votes by the Democrats. Without it, the Republicans can filibuster a bill to death. The state assembly passed a law allowing the new governor, Devil Patrick, to appoint an interim senator until special elections have concluded. He chose a Democrat, Paul Kirk. This meant that the Senate had until the end year to pass the Affordable Care Act. They had to rush it, pushing through a draft that could have been better in December in 2010. The special elections were conducted in January and Scott Brown, Republican, had an upset win, thus ending the supermajority that the Democrats in Senate enjoyed. At time, any living and breathing Democrat was basically expected to win the Senate seat. Attorney General of MA Martha Coakley won the primaries and decided to sit on her win. Meanwhile, Scott Brown worked furiously to earn his votes and started to climb the polls, while his opponent wasn't anywhere nearly as much to be seen campaigning. At one point, Coakley answered a question of her what she should be doing to combat her sliding popularity in the contest with a rhetorical question, as opposed to standing outside Fenway Park in the cold, shaking hands with voters. This referenced the actions of Scott Brown. On top of that, she called Kurt bloody sock, shilling a Yankee fan. That was a big no-no. In the end, she lost. Scott Brown won, thus ending the supermajority that the Democrats enjoyed in the Senate. Many years ago I worked for a gaming company that was an offshoot from a Southwestern development company. There were a lot of differences between these two wings, including age. We were a young lot, 20s, and the others were in their 30s. While they had a lot of experience dealing with correctness and maintainability of software, we were more concerned with prove/disprove an idea, coolness, and fun factor. Some genius manager somewhere decided that the gaming group had to learn from the other group without taking into account the fact that we throw away 90% of what we create because most of it was not fun points and changes that happened overnight. Massive test case repo. Since automation was not happening in the graphics driver, we had to do manual tests for non-unit tests, blocking non-relevant websites like /.org and gomasatra.com because it sounded too similar to Sech Yoga. Code reviews by the software group. Imagine writing shader code in assembly and having it reviewed by Java programmers. Visual Source safe for source code control and content control. There was Scrum thrown around, though I didn't know what they were on about. They gave up pretty quickly on this. To be fair, there were other things they implemented, like some design patterns, code branching strategy, that greatly helped me, personally, but we'll not talk about the broken clock also being right twice a day. Point this lead to slowed pace of output. It is an idea that needs to be proven. I have to write these test cases, only to have the code thrown out, because of the fun factor. This taught me to deduce now you have two products to maintain. Your product and the test cases better be worth the cost. Now I use the sophisticated phrase cost of quality. My interest in SSH and SSH proxies and DNS mirroring, along with discovering things like /etc/hosts. All courtesy of the articles I had read on, you guessed it, /ted.org. How to do checkbox oriented code reviews and miss the intent of code reviews. Java programmers loving their life when comparing their beans to DirectX and com/com plus win32. Also them pitying us C++ programmers for memory leaks, art assets, binary in nature, randomly getting corrupted. VSS was fine for code, but for binaries? Needless to say, this left a bad taste in our mouth about anything they brought to us. Took me a couple of good mentors to unlearn and relearn better practices. In my opinion, knowledge hurt us. There was no one wise enough to start with the problem and then think about the solutions. My boss didn't like that I would go out regularly for a few puffs of a cig. It was a family-owned business and I ran it for him. He was still working with us, but I was the hiring/firing guy and the office manager, and could pay employees with the company credit card they gave me. It goes to say that I have a lot of responsibility with the business. He came to me one day and said I take too much free time and I need to clock out. Whenever I leave my desk, I was going out about once an hour for literally under 2 minutes and never took my 15-minute breaks. The next 2 weeks I clocked every employee in and out every time they stepped away from their desk for non-work related things. This included the owner and his wife, who both worked with us and didn't make salary, so they could skimp on taxes and give themselves overtime each paycheck point. I'm happy to say that was not an issue for very long and ended very quickly. I made my point that I'm not a time thief and I'm a damn good worker. To be fair, I was taking more time than my lunch and 2 15-minute breaks allowed, but out of the 8 employees I was third to last on the list of abused time management. The owner's wife and the 2 sales girls were the worst, followed by the designer, the owner, and then myself. I used to work at a large chain supermarket with something like 500 staff. It was more like a knock-on effect of selfishness / cheapness / rule-making frenzies that caused issues. So first, we had this rule that if you bought something to eat for your lunch from the store, you had to keep the receipt and get a supervisor staff member to sign to say they witnessed you purchase it. This was to prevent people stealing food, although I'm not sure if this had ever actually been a problem or if the rule even helped. The whole process took half your break sometimes, since the supervisors were always busy and didn't even have a pen half of the time. So people would just buy their lunch and get whoever checked them out to promise to back them up if they got called out. Then we got a new supervisor from another store. She decided that this would now be strictly enforced, with security guards at the foot of the stairs up to the staff areas, searching everyone's bags. This led to queues for everyone entering or exiting the staff area. It meant that lots of people got penalized for being late to clock into their shift, back from break, etc., and that anyone who did follow the rules and get their receipts signed would not have time to eat whatever they bought. Security were even sanctioned to randomly search lockers for possible stolen food / goods. They had to pull you off the shop floor for this too, and some supervisors even tried to get the affected members of staff to clock out for the process, which turned out to be pretty illegal, so it turned into a whole thing. Some people started getting pissed at this and did one of 2 things. They went to the McDonald's opposite the store on their break. They often had to queue, and there was no discount, but at least they'd get to eat. Management didn't like people leaving the store though, since it made things difficult in case of fire, etc. Plus there was now burger wrappers and stuff clogging up all the bins. So they banned people being able to leave the store on their breaks. This led to parking tickets, because people couldn't move their cars, maximum 4-hour stay, with no special provisions for staff. It also led back to the stairs queue, and people to get disciplinary actions taken against them if they left to go to their bank, or take a phone call outside, or whatever. People brought their own lunches. This led to even worse problems. Most people who worked there also did their grocery shopping there due to the 10% discount. Even if they didn't, the security guards searching bags didn't have any proof that people weren't just buying / stealing food from the store then throwing them in a lunchbox. So people either started doing exactly that and just taking an empty lunchbox to work with them to fill, or they would start bringing their grocery receipts with them to work. Security were forced to gather the receipts and check off the items on them, so more queues. B. Previously, the only people bringing a packed lunch had been ours and management, so there was only a single large fridge in the break area. Now all the checkout and floor staff were bringing packed lunches. There wasn't enough room for everyone. Since management and ours typically work 9 to 5, and floor staff could start work anytime from 5:30 am, this led to outrage, since management / HR felt they should have exclusive access to the limited space. So rather than buy additional fridges, they moved the fridge into the our office, which was locked until 9 am when they started, and which regular staff weren't allowed to enter without a valid reason. This pissed a lot of people off, naturally, but worse than that, since this all began in the summer months, people that brought a packed lunch started getting sick. Turns out that storing yogurts, meat sandwiches, etc. in an unconditioned locker room under everyone's coats and bags, right be the radiator. Yeah, people were calling in sick with food poisoning or diarrhea. which lead to more absences from food poisoning, and he meant that management decided to crack down on calling in sick. The new rules were that all sickness absence had to be accompanied by a doctor's note no matter what. Since food poisoning tends to last only a day, and NHS wait times are more like 2 weeks for a doctor's appointment, people were getting disciplinary hearings for not bringing notes. Additionally, there was a 3 strikes policy on calling in sick. Basically, if you called in once and took a week, it was the same as calling in for a day. So even though there was no sick pay, a lot of people took multiple days, or even multiple weeks off, since they would get the same punishment anyway, and a lot of staff were college students who didn't care that much. So they were ending up with less instances of calling in sick, but higher rates of absences overall. So management decided that supervisors were now going to be sent on home visits to repeat offenders to ensure they were actually sick. Luckily, this only got as far as day 1. One of the first people visited happened to be in the union, which most of us hadn't joined due to the cost. Sick from dialysis treatments and absolutely furious, she called in her union rep and recounted everything that had been happening, along with a bunch of other stuff I haven't mentioned. The union came in, and boy, did they have some shit to do. A ton of management got moved around / sacked. Thousands were spent on new break room stuff, including fridges and vending machines, most of the previous rules overturned, etc. Even the store manager got replaced. The 3 strikes rule remained, but home visits were no longer allowed, and no doctor's notes were required for calling in sick for less than 3 days. There was an exception with diarrhea, since we worked with food, where you would have to get a doctor's note regardless, so most people would just lie about what their illness was. Basically, one power-hungry supervisor that decided to start over enforcing a rule nobody cared about caused a huge conflict. Community college school. That's mostly a commuter school as the houses near the college are expensive I mean like multi-millionaire status, most of which are not available for students to dorm in. So kids from all over the state has to commute to this school from very far away. Most of these kids, being that they're poor and taking out financial aid and loans, can't afford cars. They take public transportation. Now tardiness was treated as one half of an absence. 2 absences would mean you fail the course. This kind of school policy felt stupid, because beforehand, this college wasn't all that competitive. It felt like a literal policy to make poor students' lives harder and make them fail easier. Particularly that would mean mostly Latin American students and black students coming from poorer neighborhoods. Whenever I had that loud, slightly ignorant black girl in my lab group, I would go the extra mile to help her learn the material, because 1, a lot of these girls had kids and 2, they had disadvantaged schooling, and 3, the school policies literally set itself up to fail these kinds of students. Now, the department head who made those standards all got fired. There is no penalty for being late anymore. If the teacher does feel a grudge, it's more so that they lost their train of thought during lecture, rather than they wanting to penalize you, and that affects the whole class. But if someone can come in the class without distracting anyone, why is it a problem? There is no penalty for absence, except more than 2 absence and you lose a letter grade each time. If you have a legitimate excuse and communicate with professor, your absences don't count whatsoever. It didn't used to be this lenient. It was horrendous back then, as they wouldn't even accept a goddamn doctor's note. I remember in statistics course, I got strep throat and gave a doctor's note to the dean saying I'll be out for like a week or 2. My professor failed me and I had to appeal to the dean, and this process literally took 2 years to figure out, which at the time the statistics course put me on academic probation. That was a long time ago, like 10 years ago. Ironic they have way more lenient attendance policy now, and I'm never absent or late anymore. Not sure it's a massive backfire, but Seattle just passed a sugary drink tax not long ago that's now in effect, and there are several problems with it. It's a sales-based tax, which is inherently regressive. For instance, it has a greater impact on the poor, who are already more likely to consume cheap food/drinks with little nutritional value. Seattle is routinely ranked among the healthiest cities in the country. So it's not like we have a high rate of obesity or weight-related health problems that needs to be curbed. You can just drive outside the city to get your sugary drinks without paying the added tax. I actually go to a Costco outside Seattle now for my Red Bull needs. The employees at that Costco told me they've seen a significant bump in business since Seattle passed the tax. We just voted on and passed a state-wide initiative that places a ban on other cities implementing their own sugar taxes. So now the disparity pointed out in #3 is basically codified into law. As an armchair lawyer, this initiative seems to conflict with our state constitution's requirement that allows cities to tax their citizens however they see fit. It's just a misguided and backwards way of addressing the obesity crisis and all the health problems that come with it. Really, we need a state income tax to replace all of our aggressive sales taxes, but it's political suicide around here for anyone who even proposes or talks about it. Edit. Thought of another example that's Seattle specific and a bit more massive and the impact it's had. I can't speak for other states that have legalized marijuana, but here in Warren, specifically Seattle, legalizing marijuana has removed one problem, incarceration for possession of marijuana, and exacerbated another, higher rates of hard drug usage. Back when we legalized, my wife was working for a non-profit dedicated to youth homelessness. This is totally anecdotal, as I don't have any charts/stats to back this up, but she said that she and her staff saw a significant shift in the drugs these kids were using, moving away from marijuana and towards heroin and meth. Street prices of weed went up to better match, but still undercut the taxed retail prices, so the better cost/value purchase for getting high became the harder drugs. I'd be curious if other cities have seen the same trend. I'm a retail manager and managed a small corporate chain, mall stores with clothing/memorabilia/whatnot that I won't name. A few years back, the store was very oriented towards a certain subculture, and we hired people who looked and fit the image, leading to a lot of the employees being friends outside of work. Most of them were good kids and none of them I would consider to be big partiers, but at one point only of them found a section in the employee handbook stating an employee of the legal age can have no more than 2 alcoholic beverages on a break or within 4 hours of their shift starting time. We were in a big mall with multiple bars/restaurants, and one of the bars in the mall offered a birthday boot in the tradition of those German glass boots people drink out of. It was massive and kind of a gimmick, probably weighing in around a liter or so each, and although it was a birthday item you could purchase one for like $15 or something. A few of my employees found this out and took it upon themselves to see if they could slam 2 on their breaks to add some spice to the second half of their shift. Soon enough my entire staff was taking their breaks in sync and trying to drink each other under the table, all in a 35-minute time span. The restaurant was making bank on all the boots and started encouraging them/offering them incentives for buying multiple boots. Being a giant corporate retailer who's still in almost every mall, there was little I could do to change the company policy, and to this day I'm pretty sure that is still included in the employee handbook. After the communist revolution in China, the party had to find a way to modernize the economy and feed the very rural population. This caused 2 problems. Firstly, the party encouraged farmers to smelt all the iron they could in backyard furnaces to make material for construction, etc. However, the iron they produced was virtually unusable because they made most of it out of household cooking utensils and farming equipment. Furthermore, the peasants burnt furnishings to fuel the furnaces, only adding to their poverty. Secondly, in order to combat disease and other problems in agriculture, the party introduced the pests campaign. One of these pests was sparrows, who are crops and generally annoyed the farmers. As such, a bounty was placed on sparrows and they were killed wholesale by the farmers for a reward. However, this led to a massive increase in crop destroying insects, a massive factor in the eventual Great Famine. Now you'd think that the farmers and local officials would do something once they realized it was all going wrong, but no. Party directives incentivized the officials to fulfill quotas and push their locals further, resulting in the famine that killed millions. TLDR, killing sparrows and burning and smelting household possessions in China caused a famine that killed millions. I used to work at Sam's Club in their cafe. Around closing time we would throw all the food away and start cleaning up. Sometimes the food was so stale we couldn't sell it, so we would close a few minutes early to prevent people from buying up the nasty food. Our cafe manager caught wind of this, took everyone into the back room, and screamed at us for closing early. She implemented a new rule that basically dictated that we could not log out of our registers until 8:30 on the dot, and we had to prepare fresh food 10 minutes before closing. So for the next few months we prepared fresh food just before closing, and maybe one or two customers would come along. For the most part, we were throwing away more food than before. Our club manager came by and asked us why our inventory was so low every week, and we told him that we had to prepare an extra batch of food every evening that never got bought, and the morning shift people would restock the normal amount of food for the day. He was visibly upset. Our sales were lower than ever apparently. We were told to stop following this rule immediately. The cafe manager then got into a fight with the club manager, and the next week we were all expecting a new cafe manager, but nope. All of us were given the option of changing clubs or switching to a different position. They were closing the cafe for good. I quit right then and there. I was playing youth hockey in the mid/late 90s. Anyone who went through USA hockey at the time probably remembers that they went with no touch offsides for a bit. The rule was to eliminate injuries or something, but it was dumb. On a normal fists, if a player from one team is inside the opponent's blue line, and the puck is played by a teammate across the blue line, the player can't touch the puck or they're offsides. They can go on their side of the line, and then skate in after the puck. This is called touching up. USA Hockey, in their infinite wisdom, removed the allowance for touching up. If your team was offsides, you all had to leave the offensive zone and could not re-enter until the other team left their own zone. This caused a number of issues that I saw firsthand. Teams that were up a goal would hold the puck in their zone as long as they wanted, especially if the reffing was bad. South of I-70, the reffing was almost uniformly bad. There was an allowance in the rulebook that let the refs move the face-off into the defensive zone of a team that committed an egregious offsides. For some refs, picking up and carrying the puck into the offensive zone while your team was offsides was not egregious. For other refs, simply being offsides at all was egregious. On too many occasions, this would occur with the same ref in the same game, with rules applied differently depending on the team. Usually, the home team benefited from this, which led to, I saw more injuries from no-touch offsides in 5 minutes than I saw from standard offsides. A couple teams playing before my team got in a brawl where one team, down a goal, and having the puck be held against them in their opponent's offensive zone, just decided to go in and crush someone. First guy hit goes down with a concussion. 2 actual fights break out. One player from fight A skates off holding his shoulder, and a player from fight B skates away holding his face with blood streaming from between his fingers. Come to find out that the game had gotten out of hand due to inconsistent reffing benefiting the home team, who we were to play the next day. Lovely. USA Hockey ditched the rule after a year or two, and my coach threw an actual party for the occasion. A former place of employment had a trio of rules that backfired spectacularly. The first 2 were implemented about 6 months before the third, but the effects weren't seen for about a year, when customers started going elsewhere, and our its systems started crashing over poorly programmed user databases. No username or email can be reused, period. For any reason at all. Also, to ensure this policy, no user object can ever be deleted, moved to a child domain, graveyard for terminated accounts, or otherwise altered after the employee is terminated. All emails are required to be legal. First name, .legal, last name, @company.com, no exceptions. If the email already exists, just add a number at the end of the name point. When a field worker's project wrapped up, they are fired, unless a new job starts immediately. If the job is 2 weeks out, fire the guy and rehire him in 2 weeks taken together. This means that Juan Perez, for example, we hired had to have juan.perez@company.com as their email. And when they were hired a few weeks later, they got a new address with a different number. In the 4 years I was there, I think the leader was Manny, who was on Manny.lastname36@company.com. And he was the only one with his name we ever hired. Working in customer service, 90% of rules backfire because the people making the rules aren't required to actually come down and even see where the rules are being implemented, let alone consider how they affect the people that have to follow them. Point X. We had one customer last year raise a huge stink, and, to be fair, to an extent there were things that could have gone better, and corporate overreacted so dramatically that their new rules they came up with regarding how to handle escalated situations created thousands of more complaints in response. The problem was that they wanted us to treat pretty much every contact from a customer as an escalation. Basically, anytime anyone even asked a question we had to treat it as a complaint, which quickly turned into an actual complaint because people weren't complaining, they were just asking questions. But if we didn't treat it as a complaint, then we could be written up or fired. One misgrievance is grounds for automatic termination. They lessened up after they got sick and tired of fielding all the escalations. Plus, our time per customer shot through the roof, and these companies are always all about the quantity, but technically the rule is still super vague, so if someone wanted to go and write us up for not treating every question as an escalation, they could point, and when I say question, I mean basic questions, like how do I update my phone number, was supposed to be treated as an escalated situation, or else it was so bad. After the communist revolution in China, the party had to find a way to modernize the economy and feed the very rural population. This caused two problems. Firstly, the party encouraged farmers to smelt all the iron they could in backyard furnaces to make material for construction, etc. However, the iron they produced was virtually unusable because they made most of it out of household cooking utensils and farming equipment. Furthermore, the peasants burnt furnishings to fuel the furnaces, only adding to their poverty. Secondly, in order to combat disease and other problems in agriculture, the party introduced the pests campaign. One of these pests was sparrows, who are crops and generally annoyed the farmers. As such, a bounty was placed on sparrows and they were killed wholesale by the farmers for a reward. However, this led to a massive increase in crop destroying insects, a massive factor in the eventual Great Famine. Now you'd think that the farmers and local officials would do something once they realized it was all going wrong, but no. Party directives incentivized the officials to fulfill quotas and push their locals further, resulting in the famine that killed millions. TLDR, killing sparrows and burning and smelting household possessions in China caused a famine that killed millions. In the county I live in, Maisha, there are two schools near the county line. School A, which has a really good reputation, and School B, which isn't that bad, but doesn't have anything like the reputation of A in the UK, which state school you go to is determined entirely by geographical proximity and demand. So naturally, there are loads of housing estates built near School A, entirely so that parents can get their children into it. There's only one snag. School A technically isn't in Maisha. It's just over the county line, in Othershire. Per the standard rules this doesn't make any difference, but it was a central point of argument for Othershire, who didn't like the idea of another county taking advantage of their school. They wanted to change the rules so that more folks from Othershire could get into School A, but Maisha's houses are closer, and Othershire has less housing near it, so bypassing the rules on catchment to that extent would be difficult. Their eventual attempt was this. Priority for School A would be based on the extra distance. As the crow flies, a pupil would travel to go to School B instead of A. Those who could more easily go to B instead would do so. The theory behind this was that, although the houses in Maisha were nearer School A, they were also nearer School B, whereas Othershire's houses would be further from B, even if they were equidistant from A. But that's not what that rule does. No, that rule has some really odd effects. You might need to grab a bit of paper at this point for a bit of geometry. Draw two dots, B above and A below, then draw a line through them, and down off the rest of the page. As you go down that line, both A and B get further away from you. But the extra distance between B and A never changes, so in fact, this formula doesn't measure much in distance, unless you are actually between A and B, which the vast majority weren't. No, it measures your deflection from the line between A and B, which resulted in a really strange distribution, and oddly, one that didn't vary with distance. Someone closer to the line, but miles away could be chosen over someone further away from the line and nearby. In fact, the road actually next to school A and in Othershire was minimum priority by this scheme because it pointed towards B. They revised it pretty quickly, but it's a great example of how not knowing your geometry can cause all kinds of issues. 2 things with my company. I work for a media/advertisement company. We are always dead on July 4th. The biggest reason is obviously all the sales and ads were for the days leading up to this holiday. In years past, we were off. 1 year, the head of marketing changed it so that we had to show up on July 4th. The reason was to show all of our customers that we are a hard-working media group that is open 24/7, no matter the holidays. We constantly told them that we are dead and will have nothing to do, but of course they never listen. Once the holiday came, nothing. Not a single ad/sale. The entire company was dead as a doornail and the higher ups are freaking out, as if they never saw this coming. All of us got paid to sit at our desks and do nothing. Same company, everyone I work with, manager included, are all underpaid. Raises are basically non-existent. So in all we are really cheap labor for the company. Well, the company was looking into finding an outside source so they can save money. They told us to handle a certain part of the workload and this other source will take care of the rest. They thought they can get a better deal elsewhere. We never said anything to them. We all knew it was going to backfire, since we were already dirt cheap to begin with, and knew it would be hard to find labor even cheaper. Of course, we were right again. Not even 2 months later, they realized that they messed up, and it costed them more money. Plus we had all this extra overtime to undo the damage they started. I worked maintaining a salad bar at a chain restaurant that very proudly advertised its salad bar. On really busy shifts, like Saturday dinner or Sunday lunch, they'd have 2 people working on it. With so many items and people, we quickly determined that the best way to handle it was to have one person in the kitchen making as many dishes of ingredients as possible, and the other person taking them out as they emptied on the salad bar. At peak times, this would keep both people constantly working and barely keeping up. Well, the boss got a bit upset and told us one person had to stay up front at all times in order to help customers and help the place look maintained. So instead of 2 workers rushing around and struggling to keep the place barely maintained, you'd have one guy just standing by the salad bar and smiling, even as things ran out and people started asking about them. And because the only radios we had weren't clear and picked up the messages of a nearby restaurant, there was no way to tell the person in the back what was missing. Items would run out and there was no guarantee when it would be brought out. We didn't even wait for the boss to get mad at us for not staying at our post and just settled for ignoring his advice. When I was in college, I worked in a warehouse managed by without a doubt the worst collection of human beings that could possibly be assembled to manage a thing. There should be a class dedicated to these idiots at Wharton, how to annihilate morale and foster a contemptuous attitude among employees. 101 point. Here's the biggest testament to their uncanny incompetence. Shortly after the beginning of the school year, they announced the 1-hour rule. If you're going to miss a single hour or more of work or more in a given day, your time card will get a NP, non-pay, designation. This shithole didn't have paid time off until you'd been there 10 plus years. This went over, as you might have expected, very poorly. The first few weeks, I started noticing how short-handed we were, and I'd hear shit like, well, Mike had to take his daughter to the orthodontist this morning. He would have been in by now, but that fucking 1-hour rule kept him home today. Management starts putting the spurs to use because we are not meeting schedule, and, of course we aren't. We running at 80% manpower on a good day. So they call us in for another announcement. We are thinking they're about to walk back their boneheaded 1-hour rule. Nope. They double down on it. Anyone with 2 or more NP designations in the calendar year will be terminated. However, they have a new designation for people subject to the 1-hour rule. App, adjusted pay. The app hourly rate, $0. So, get this, you need to run your kid to the doctor and you're going to miss a couple hours of work, right? Cool. Go do that, come to work, and work the last 10 hours of your shift for $0 an hour, because if you don't, you're going to be fired. Management argued they could do this because minimum wage laws consider your weekly wages, not daily. This is just hilariously untrue. I remember this one fat prick manager, let's call him Dan, because that's his real name, kept trying to normalize this sheet by saying stuff like there should be no mathematical way this drops your weekly wages below the state minimum wage. Welp, that fat prick ate those words. A couple weeks after that announcement, a guy who worked on the ramps received his paycheck, and, when he did the math, he discovered he did indeed make less than minimum wage for the hours he had worked. He approached management simply asking to have his pay adjusted up to minimum wage and they refused. When he protested, they fired him. And he sued. I ran into this guy a few years ago, and he told me that the settlement was significant enough to pay off his house, buy a new car for him and his wife, pay off all their debts, and send his wife back to college. That was beyond gratifying to hear, and the management team, they walked the 1-hour rule back to its first iteration. Wells Fargo had a rule of 3x3, or whatever the fuck they called it. Basically getting 3 customers to open 3 new accounts for services every day or week. Every teller/sales associate had to meet those goals. Basically there was rampant fraud from fake accounts, checking, savings, line of credit CCT, being created by employees, and the line managers turned a blind eye because anyone not meeting their sales goal were fired or punished. The scandal took Wells Fargo down several notches as a retail banking institution. They prided themselves on being the fastest growing retail banking provider, and how strong their retail side was. Story time. I remember being in college and the recruiter laughed at how other banks struggled during the bailouts due to their mortgage securitization and derivatives business. WF kept saying how their retail business was so strong, and it was a shining light during the recession. The culture was toxic at Wells Fargo. Instead of taking care of clients, they had a sales mentality. I remember sitting for an interview with a district manager and a manager at WF Bank for a outside sales position for a payment processing solution for small businesses. After the interview I went home and yacked in my own mouth. Mind you, I worked for a tobacco company at the time, and by no means was I mother the sap. But goddamn, the boiler room interview environment was beyond anything. When the manager called me and offered me a panel interview as a next step, I him no thanks. Imagine a bank teller who made $30k a year or less being put through the ringer and forced to do ethically questionable practices for the sake of sales. Fuck that noise. At my high school, I'm in Norway, so it wasn't called that, but it's the closest equivalent. Students who smoked were allowed to take breaks to do so, within reason. I don't smoke, but that's important context for later. I use snus, which for those who are unaware, is tobacco, loose or in a small pouch, that you leave under your upper lip. It's kind of like tip, but without the spitting point and a hoe. At some point they banned snus in the school, because a bunch of first year dipshits, no pun intended, couldn't be bothered to spit it into a trash can or leave it in the lid on the can, instead leaving it all over the faking place like animals. That was, as I'm sure you can imagine, pretty annoying to those of us who were responsible addicts. How did this rule backfire? Well, smoking was also banned on school premises and always had been, but as I said before, smokers were allowed to go for a smoke now and then, at least by most of my teachers. So it was argued that, if they were allowed to do that, we should be allowed to do so too. It was only fair. The thing is, a cigarette doesn't take that long to smoke. Snus can remain in your mouth for 45 minutes to an hour and be fine, depending on type. So if we wanted to be real dicks about it, which we did, instead of stepping out for a few minutes, we'd be gone for almost an hour at a time. I don't know if that rule was ever officially removed, but it didn't take long for teachers to just ignore it entirely, so it might as well have been. Not as exciting as other stories in this thread, I'm sure, but it came to mind, so there you go. I've got 2. My university operates in trimesters and is located in northern Wisconsin, and it gets very cold. So they decided that they would shorten the first trimester of the year, making it end in late November, so the students would leave the campus for the last week of November and the entire month of December. That way, the administration reasoned they wouldn't have to pay the electric bill to keep the dorms and halls heated and lit during the cold, dark Wisconsin winter. However, they forgot one small detail. There's students that don't/can't go home for the holidays, like international students or students from distant areas of the country. So basically the university lost money because they had to keep the lights, heating, almost all university services on anyway, and the tuition and housing bill is less for almost everyone, since everyone has a break from classes and most are off campus once the first trimester ends in late November and don't return until early January. And this wasn't just a one-off either. This large winter break continues to this day, since the school was too lazy to restore the first trimester to its proper length point. So, good for the students, bad for the administration. Point also, same university, in the middle of each trimester there's a few days where there are no classes called midterm reading period. The idea is, of course, to use those days to study for midterms. One year, the administration decided to cancel midterm reading period for the whole year. I guess they thought it wasn't needed anymore. Point in the first trimester alone, we had our first student suicides in a long time and the average grade dropped quite a bit as well. Midterm reading period was reinstated for the rest of the year and hasn't been touched since. I'm a picker at a distribution center. We have different drop zones for different pick paths. Recently there was a change that eliminated a quality assurance check. Instead of dropping product at a drop zone to allow another person to scan and verify the correct number of items in correct drop zone, they decided to cut those man hours and instead had the pickers dump the products of this certain path into a large cardboard bulk box. I raised a concern to my boss and boss about how this would cause a major increase in theft and loss of product, and called it a very stupid idea. My bosses agreed. I saw this company just trying to cut corners to increase profits. Nothing illegal, just stupid. Point throughout one shift we may be in 6 different pick paths, so it's not uncommon for some products to be dropped off at wrong drop zones. Well, about 3 days after implementing this new innovative cost-saving idea, a picker dumped several containers of the wrong pick path product into the bulk box that was not caught until the end of the shift. This resulted in a loss of man hours discovering the problem, sorting through the bulk box, and it delayed the shipment by days. After so many hours they were not able to get all the missing products and wrote it off as a loss. I addressed my boss later and gave him an "I told you so," and he nodded in agreement. Point the company still has not reinstated the quality check procedure. Late to the party. In high school we had a rather large class, and because of that our class was classified as problematic. 33 people instead of 28. Result, we had the headmaster of our school year in our class to enforce several rules which were noted down and resulted in severe penalties if neglected. Point always have your books with you. Be on time. Even 1 minute too late is punishable. Have your homework finished. No talking between classmates when the teacher is speaking. Phone/other equipment not class or lesson related are not allowed. As you can see, all these rules are obvious and should already be enforced. The problem was that, now that it was written down, the teacher had to enforce them. Point the penalty for violating one of the rules is that you are sent out of class and have to do detention the last 2 hours of the day, 8 and 9th hour, 3 p.m. to 4:40 p.m. Conclusion. When someone forgot a book, or didn't know part of the homework assignment, or was a minute too late, because of whatever reason, they were sent out of class before long. The detention skyrocketed. People were missing classes left and right for forgetting a book, which would be solved by working together with your neighbor. Grades started dropping because obviously people were missing valuable information in classes. They quickly dropped the hammer on that one. They altered the enforcement rule so that the teacher had more authority and could also hand out minor punishments. Worked for an airline that couldn't make schedule work due shortage of pilots. Management denied any shortage and, in addition, came to the union lamenting the astronomical overtime bill. Point I don't know how, but it was agreed that the payments for extra work, working on days off, and disruption were to be stopped. The overtime would be available, but no financial compensation would be given. Point the airline's overtime bill dropped to 0 overnight. Great success. You can all see this coming. I'm still staggered it wasn't immediately obvious to the airline. Overtime stopped. No working late. No extra payments. No working beyond contractual minimums. Like 0 point on day 1 it wasn't so bad. The company burned its standby cover. Some trainers had to drop training duties and manager pilots had to fly to keep the show on the road. Point on day 2 they cancelled a few flights. For some strange reason, nobody was willing to work overtime. Odd point on day 3 nearly a fifth of the airline was grounded. Issues compound. Aircraft were out of position. Crew were demanding complete rest periods. It's common practice to reduce rest keep the operation going. No captains were exercising their discretion to extend duty periods. Planes were at stations with no crew to fly them, and no crew available to rescue the hull. No plane means no flight. The operation with no incentive to work. The operation was on its knees within 3 days. 25% of the schedule was cancelled. Needless to say, they reinstated the payments. It took nearly a week for the operation to return to normal. Point source was a BALPA union rep for London-based pilots. Was given this story as a cautionary tale to feed to our management. They wouldn't swallow it without proof, so I dragged the correspondence from the archives. It was terrific reading. My favorite email was sent by a union rep to the director of flight operations at the end of day 3. All it said was, "Are you satisfied yet?" In Ultima Online you could escort nobles from city to city for 600 gold. At that time it would take an entire day's worth of killing monsters or earth elementals for mid-level players. However, nobles actually had the 600 gold in their inventory and they were unarmed. So players killed the nobles and looted their corpses instead of escorting them without consequence. The game was meant to test the virtue of players, but that aspect was overambitious at best. Instead the developers took the gold out of the nobles packs and made it so that attacking the nobles would trigger 6 archers to be summoned and immediately kill the offending player. Thus, the nobles never really needed an escort to begin with. Kind of a waste of other good mechanics in the game, like being labeled a murderer and having bounties put on literally your decapitated head. Another rule that backfired in that game was item insurance. After stealing from other players had been a skill from the start of the game, a vocal minority complained about their stuff being taken by use of the steal skill. So ensuring an item ensured that item could not be stolen, and upon death 600 gold would be deducted from a player's bank to keep the item in the player's pack each time the player was resurrected. If they had allowed items to be stolen and replaced at the price of insurance, it would have overinflated the economy a lot sooner, I think. However, item insurance completely ruined the economy. Shops that sold armor had to toil for months to make the top tier armor, only to have it sold at an outrageous price, and then back to toiling to make another decent piece of gear. The real magic of the stealing skill was that when combined with wrestling, or thief could disarm their opponent and steal their weapon through clever use of macros. However, a saving grace of the thieving profession was that, to get permission to steal from other players, one needed to swear an oath to the Thieves Guild never to kill an innocent player. So even though you could defend yourself by stealing weapons, its PvP use was limited to only non-murderous players. And thank goodness for that. I'm not sure why item insurance affected stealing. I just think EA could not give two craps about a game mechanic without a forum full of angry players. I can't even log into any of my 4 accounts today. They changed the credentials from Ultima Online to Origin to some other random consultancy that manages the game now. So I would need 3 passwords and a few hours or days of tech support to log in. TLDR, UO, nobles, item insurance, negligence. My college was very small, and really the only place students could go to party was the senior apartments or the fraternity court. School tradition said that freshmen weren't allowed to go down to those places for the first 2 weeks. So hopefully they could settle in and get their shit together without being in the center of the party scene. Plenty of freshmen snuck down there anyway, but it was in the culture enough that it was a minor thing. At the end of the 2 weeks was a big night. First night down, both the senior apartments and frat court are at the bottom of a large hill, where freshmen are finally allowed down the hill. Naturally you got a lot of young freshmen with very little experience with alcohol going nuts all at once. So you usually ended up getting 4 or 5 kids taking an ambulance ride for alcohol poisoning. The administration decided that they didn't like all those alcohol problems on first night down, so after my freshman year, they got rid of it. The problem is, that now meant that all of the freshmen were sneaking down to the court and going wild from day one. Instead of one big night of alcoholic indulgence, they were getting steady violations and alcohol poisoning cases for weeks every year. The freshmen had no support system because they didn't know any of their peers yet, and they had no reason to hold back for those first few weeks because there was no social pressure to do something other than go down and binge drink. When I left they still hadn't brought it back, and they'll probably have trouble reinstituting it because all of the students who remembered how it worked and would hold each other to that standard will have graduated. They could never enforce it without students wanting to participate in the tradition. So now instead of students holding each other accountable, it's a total free-for-all. In my tiny middle school, 400 students total in the whole K-8 school district, a group of teachers went to a seminar on gang violence. Now this tiny rural school is literally situated across the road from a cattle farm. However, the teachers learned that gangs use clothing, like hooded sweatshirts, to communicate, so the school bizarrely banned them. In this tiny rural poor community, hooded sweatshirts were sometimes the only way some students had to keep warm. So we had kids coming in t-shirts in the winter. You know what else happens in rural schools? Having to walk a couple of miles to get to where the bus picks you up, then riding on the school bus for over an hour, and it's almost certainly a 25-year-old bus without working heat points. So we, the student population, decided to Google gang signs because we didn't know. You see, contrary to administration belief, we spent the next few weeks flashing gang signs, wearing red or blue do-rags, rolling up a single pant leg, you name it. The still completely and obnoxiously out of touch administration brought in gang detectives from the nearest major city to drive all the way out here and investigate. I can distinctly remember seeing two men with guns in suits trying very hard to stifle their laughter as they made notes into their notepads as kids flashed gang signs at them while trying to stifle their laughter. TLDR, school bans hooders to prevent gangs from forming, results in gangs forming. Old job at Target a bunch of years back, they made this policy where all the executive supervisors got these things called cards. Basically company credit cards with $500 on it that would renew every day so that they could spend money on things like rewards and recognition for employees. This was due to this annual best team survey Target would conduct where employees got to evaluate the store and the supervisors. 1 year recognition and appreciation got the lowest score on the survey, and the company's answer to this was to give cards to like 12 executive supervisors. Sheet got out to hand so quick and these people were maximuming out the card almost on a daily basis. By the end of the year in our store, the highest volume in our state, and one of the highest volume within the whole company by the way, between everyone they accumulated almost $120,000 in expenses, the highest in our state, and this wasn't even counting other non-recognition related things they used with the company's budget. The second place store that had spent the most came in at $45,000 and this was the second highest volume store in our state that usually only fell shy by a couple hundreds or thousands of bucks behind us with our daily sales goals. Let that sink in. Immediately the year after this disaster, everyone got their cards revoked and our store manager was tasked with a non-existent goal of ending the year with under $28,000 in used expenses. We got us wrapped and she got punished. I couldn't imagine how much her job sucked that year, trying to make corporate happy while trying to keep the whole store staff pleased with nothing to give away as recognition/appreciation, so that the store didn't fail the best team survey again. And that, people, is what happens when your store is in between like 5 ghettos. At my old job, which was basically picking and packing online clothes, there was a lot of stupid rules, which backfired that people wouldn't stay to work there for long 80 packages/hour. This was later raised to 120/h, which was impossible, because there was a lot of orders that might have more than 150 plus pieces. Since they also sent packages to different companies, it ended up to all workers literally running around or taking only orders with 2 pieces of clothing. 0% mistake policy. So basically if you made mistake while packing, taking a wrong product or wrong color, they would either warn you or fire you instantly. Each package was checkpoint. If you don't find something, it's your fault. Even if it literally wasn't in warehouse, it's still your fault. No phones, no toilet breaks, except 30-minute lunch, no music, no talking. This place was absolutely worst where I have ever worked. Most people were foreigners who were unable to get other jobs because they didn't speak the local language, or students. And also the bosses were extremely racist towards people who were not Scandinavian, mocking them or saying racist slurs. Since I always tried to stick to the rules as much as I could, I was always put in a bit better position. First packing special orders or more expensive brands, Channel, Guxy, then checking other people's packages. I had to write down names of those who made mistakes, so they could fire them. I always tried to fix the packages with wrong items before writing their names, and in the end, gift wrapping, which was the best time of this job. I got warned 2 times of making some mistake, but they had really hard time getting and keeping the workers. I wonder why. I worked there for 6 months and still remember how awful it was to go to work every day. I had only 2 coworkers who stayed the whole time I was there, from a team of 15 people. Never got to know any of the coworkers, since they were firing people all the time. In the end they offered to change me from temporary employee to permanent. I noped and left that shithole. Mao Zedong wanted to turn China into a developed country. He asked, forced his people to get all the metal scraps they can together, make a furnace, and smelt it all down to make steel. People brought their hoes, pitchforks, pots, pans, woks, even valuable historic metal statues for them to be smelted down. The people making the steel had no idea what they were doing, and the metal used was of varying qualities. Because of these 2 factors, all China got was a bunch of scrap metal that wasn't good for much, let alone using in industrial fabrications. This also contributed to the massive famine killing many millions during that time period. And a second one, while we are at it, Mao didn't like the birds eating the crops, so he asked, again, forced his people to kill all the birds they saw. What he didn't know was that birds eat crickets. With no birds to eat the crickets, swarms of them were left alive come harvest time the next year, eating the majority of the crops, which also was a factor in the famines mentioned above. Moving to the 90s, Falun Gong was widely praised on state media in China as a good healthy exercise. It got so popular that it reached almost 100 million followers in China. However, Jiang Zemin, the president at the time, didn't like this because it was more than the number of Communist Party members. He established the 610 office to start a brutal campaign to eradicate the evil cult. This included forced confessions and lawful imprisonment, torture, forced human organ removal, and, possibly, human experimentation. Today, Falun Gong is one of the loudest and most prolific campaigners against the current fascist government in China. I could go on, but I think 3 is enough for now. Don't want to give the 50C army too much stuff to downvote and insult me for. Personal story but relevant. So my first bartender job, it's a girl/guy who legally sells you weed, was a disaster. 3 of us were hired on after the manager got promoted to ours. Great idea, right? And 3 weeks into the job we have a dispute about tips. See, we all keep up with our tips personally and do not pull, so no one was in charge of the money except yourself. Also great idea, right? Well, Mr. A accused Miss B of taking his money and the solution was no tips for anyone via ours. Even a new employee averaged $50-75 daily. I had plenty of $100 days. Several people quit. I stuck it out as I needed the money and hoped it would change. Oh, it did. 2 months after taking money literally under or outside from customers, a box was placed stating all tips would go to employees yada yada. They did not. In fact, we were told it would accumulate and then ours would plan something with the money. Yeah, right. So about $1,300 in a safe apparently disappears, and we all questioned. This place has 30 cameras in 4 rooms yet no one is caught. Oh, and they take tips away again. So yeah, we started a union. Most of us got fired after voting on it, and we all got formally compensated by the NLRB after an internal investigation. P.S. Ours still works there, lol. TLDR. We make tip and like. Tip go away when fight and fair person say no more. Tribe leave. I stay and tip come back, but in no touch box in big no touch box. Tip grow feet and leave place and fair person make angry and take away box. We make small tribe to fight fair person, but they got lots of tip, so we go to new land and spear. I was a tower climber for a small 2-way radio company. My boss went on a rampage about break times, including lunch, saying I need to be taking my breaks at 10, noon, and 3. This stemmed from him calling me at random times throughout the day, and sometimes I would be taking my lunch at 2-3 p.m. after I was done with the tower for the day. We'll bring the good worker that I listened to him. No matter what I was doing at the time, if break time rolled around I would climb down off of the tower and sit my ass down for my 15-minute breaks and leave the site to find a place to eat for my hour lunch breaks. He had also banged food and drink in the work trucks other than water. Not I didn't mind the 300-foot trek up and down the towers. His tallest was 340 feet, but most were 300 feet, so it didn't really affect me to take my breaks on time, but it sure as hell affected him. I went from climbing 2 towers a day in an 80-day to maybe 1 longer jobs that I could finish if I powered through, like running a 300 FT3 in coax. Ended up taking 2 sometimes 3 days depending on how far the tower was away from the shop. For about a month he kept saying 8 to 5, 8 to 5. Don't work overtime and stay the whole time. He ended up scrapping all of this because of me and just let me work my hours the way I always had. If I didn't take my breaks I left at 4:30. I worked my ass off for that man, but he never appreciated it. Glad I'm done with that job and I'm school now, but it was fun while it lasted. Everywhere I've delivered pizza has always made stupid rules/incentives and they always backfire. One incentive made sense on paper. Give the drivers 50 cents more mileage per run if they followed all of the rules, calling times, hustling, car topper on ECT. This was left to the discretion of the manager and wouldn't be given until the end of the day, when you could make up to 4 runs at a time. That was $2 more every time you left the store and made it all worth it. However, the managers often took away incentive for everyone based on the performance of one employee or for minor infractions like wearing a watch band the wrong color. Instead of paying a couple extra bucks to an energized group of delivery people, we all got incredibly pissed. Most of us would leave during the day once we were told the incentive wasn't to be given and had been busting our ass, and eventually we all stopped caring altogether. It resulted in slower delivery times and less money for the store. Recently, we were given an incentive/rule of 10 extra cents if we take a single order, with the assumption that it gets to the customer more quickly. As a general rule, the more orders you take at once, the more money you get. Well, gas is expensive and the store doesn't pay for that, so it's always more cost effective to take more than one order, and 10 cents is laughable. So instead of actually getting the orders to customers faster, we have been dispatching the orders early and then bringing them back in and redispatching to make our order a double, or just dispatching the orders early and then waiting anyway. The result is a lot more confusion and, surprise, people waiting a lot longer for their food. Also, it gives some of us incentive to skip over known non-tippers for whatever reason, which means some people are waiting forever for their food. So instead of waiting 5 extra minutes, so we don't get stiffed for a 30-minute round trip delivery, that person is now going to have to wait for a few grumpy delivery people to skip their order on accident until a manager notices, and then an argument will likely ensue about who has to actually bring it, which adds a lot more time. I don't know if this follows the question spirit, but here I go. My country banned any kind of forks exchange that wouldn't go through the government's hands. It was, until very recently, illegal to be paid with something else than the country's currency. If you ran a business and you needed to buy anything outside the country, you had to file some folders explicitly stating what you needed and how much would it cost. And to no one's surprise, nobody did this honestly. Then some bureaucrat would either approve or reject your petition. Of course you had to pay for the foreign currency with the national one, but for political reasons, the rate was absurdly favorable to my country's currency. Of course, smart but unscrupulous people saw an opportunity, and thus, a forks black market emerged, in which you sold whatever hard currency you had at a way higher rate, and then you bought some through the official channels. Rinse and repeat. In fact, it was pretty easy to get an approval, since institutional control was non-existent. However, 15 years after the enactment of this rule, and the government having killed its golden goose, had no more foreign currency to spare, and the absurd bureaucracy along the unreal exchange rate made almost everyone leave their once productive enterprises to become importers. What now? The rule was cancelled, with the government now asking every single citizen to sell their hard currency, which we weren't supposed to have, at an extremely unfavorable rate, while asking the few industrialists that remain to import the goods they need to keep functioning with their own hard currency. But since it was pretty much a given you would be approved, no one saved a dime, and there's now a deadlock. Normal people like me won't sell their hard currency to the government, making them unable to keep giving it away. Industrialists won't use theirs because they can't recoup it. Nobody wants our currency and we are extremely uncompetitive, and the government can't assure them fresh $ as loans since they are utterly broke. So, with every passing day fewer and fewer $ enter the country. Yet we become more dependent on imports, deepening the cycle. This simple rule will be the downfall of our government, so you can say that it backfired enormously. Australia introduced an alcopops tax, a tax on the sugary pre-mixed drinks, like vodka cruisers, that were targeted at young people, knocking them back like sodas. The intention was to reduce binge drinking. Research had found that, since the high alcohol content in these drinks was harder to detect by taste, young people were drinking more of them. By taxing them, they hoped to reduce how much of it was consumed, either reducing total drinking overall, or moving drinkers back to beer/wine/spirits, which had more strident alcohol flavors and or lower alcohol content. The estimate was that this would put $1 billion hole in the revenue of the alcopop sellers. Naturally, they didn't take this lying down. I was dating a brand ambassador for one of the majors at the time, and remember her getting called in for a war room around the announcement. Around the nation, liquor stores started selling combos of straight spirits in bulk and mixers, like lemonade/squash, so drinkers could create the same flavors at home. Cheaper, in bulk. And binge point. The whole exercise was a massive failure point, kind of like that experiment where they tried to reduce student drinking through an education campaign around prominent alcohol content indicators on bottle labels, which students used to identify which drinks had the highest alcohol content to cost ratio to get more faked up for less money. Fundamental misunderstanding of the stakeholder priorities in addressing that problem. 4-year presidential term of office, and many other shorter term political offices. When it was instituted, our country was a very different place and time. Now, to implement any kind of peaceful, lasting change, you need 5 maybe 10 years. You have to have time to research, build consensus, and trudge through the swamp to make the slow but meaningful progress. Politicians often talk about fighting for things, but we really want them to work for things, and working is harder than fighting. We need to look forward to the long term, so we need to do long-term planning. We want leaders to have time to build trust, instead of being mired in parties and politics. Candidates are faced with the impossibility of promising things that can't possibly be done well in their term of office. Ultimately, you get too much politics, not enough governance/leadership. One example is universal healthcare. The Affordable Care Act got pushed through, fought for with a winning and losing attitude, kind of like forcing a kid to play piano or do their homework, rather than inspiring them to want to play or learn. So it's been messy, and not that great, because it was so divisive. So many things like this, that are just good ideas, but get turned into political footballs with parties taking one side or the other. So the 4-year term probably made a lot of sense 200 years ago, but it needs to reflect the needs of our times and the responsibility to plan/build/govern in a much more long-term way than could probably be imagined in 1776. To put it in perspective, the average life expectancy at that time was 35, and George Washington passed on before he reached 70. The change in life expectancy alone should warrant longer terms of office, and if we started to move in that direction, I think we would see less turmoil, less rhetoric, less politics, more governance and leadership, and more lasting/peaceful changes. In the late 90s, the city of Calgary was replacing several of its bridges over the Bow River. This caused a huge amount of traffic jams, because each bridge was out of commission for several months and the remaining bridges had to take on the overflow. In total, there were 3 bridges, replaced one after the other, and this resulted in a traffic problem that lasted for over a year. Prior to this, my commute to work was about 15 minutes. During the period of bridge replacement, that commute became an hour and a half. because our office had flexible work hours. I told the company that I was contracting for that I would come in at 10 a.m. and leave later, rather than spend an hour and a half in traffic, both ways. Coming in late resulted in my usual commute time of 15 minutes, rather than 1.5 hours. They agreed that this was a good solution. A few months after this, the company got a new president who decided, of course, that he had to piss on things to show that he was in control. He sent out a memo that the office now had strict work hours and that everyone had to be in to work at 8 a.m. All of the employees, many of whom had taken a job there because of the flexible work hours, were really pissed off. They all complained, and the president stood firm, saying that this was the new policy. I booked a meeting time with him and pointed out that I would be happy to comply with the policy of being at work at 8 a.m. because that policy would cause me to sit in my car for 3 hours a day, doing nothing, which I would include on my monthly invoice. I calculated what my new monthly invoices were going to be, and I showed him the cost to the company to implement the policy. Within a day, the president rescinded the policy. Not so much as a written rule or law, but in Australia, when people realized that the sun was causing skin cancer and everyone started staying inside all the time, they started getting fat from eating more and exercising less. Prop 13 in California. Back in the 1970s, Proposition 13, state election, did two things that have caused big problems for the state. The first is that certain laws need 2/3 of the legislature to vote for something to pass it. I think budget laws and maybe some others. This has resulted in making it very difficult to pass these laws. A 55% or 60% vote would have been much better. The second thing that Prop 13 did was to limit how much property taxes could be raised every year. This was done to prevent elderly people needing to move out of their homes because their property taxes became too high. Now, we have a situation where people who bought their homes before Prop 13 passed are living in million-dollar houses and paying under $1,000 per year in property taxes. They can't afford to move to a smaller home because their taxes will shoot up to over $10,000 per year. This has resulted in 1 or 2 elderly people living in a 3 to 5 bedroom house instead of moving to a smaller house, taking that house off the market. This is part of why California has such a housing crisis. There are other factors, of course. My mother actually apologized to me for voting for Prop 13. Every time I hear a politician saying they support Prop 13, I vote against them. Unfortunately, it amended the California Constitution, so it's very difficult to change it. 2 stories in the same school, showing they never learn when messing with bored students and their dress code. Story 1 in high school, the soccer World Cup were going on, and we as a people love our soccer. First game was Brazil vs Croatia. The school said students who want to come with Brazilian soccer t-shirts could. I didn't sit well with a group of students who were rooting against Brazil in the cup. Yeah, not very patriotic, but we are already too much soccer focused here. So sue me for wanting us to go out early and stop the game holidays because no commerce wants to open during the game. Someone asked if we could come with Croatia's colors as well, and they said no, because we are Brazilians etc. During the 48 hours between the announcement and the game, we managed to get about 50 people. It was a 300 student school in my period, with Croatia t-shirts from a multicultural event that happened earlier that year. A Croatian flag, and a bunch of other paraphernalia with Croatian colors. Game day there were more people with Croatian colors than Brazilian. Never mess with our right to do shit as a teenager. Story 2 When I was in high school, my school had a rule that we could only wear uniform coats that weren't cheap. They didn't consider that there was a river about 30 meters from some classes, so in winter it got pretty fucking cold there, and no heating, because we live in a tropical country. So we used to stack lots of other coats under the school coat, pretty common and tolerable so far. Another thing, if you forgot your coat in school, it goes to the lost and found cabinets, with 2 labels named and unnamed. Only the little kinds actually named their coats by sewing it, because there was no other way. If you went in the LOF, there were very few coats in the unnamed section. Why? Think about it, you lost your coat, someone probably took it by mistake, So you go and take a random one from Lost and Found, but you can't take one with someone's name, mostly because they were small. So you take one from the unnamed point a few weeks into the cold time of the year. I lost my coat and went to the LOF, but there were no coats of my size. My mother was low on money and couldn't afford a new school coat, so she told me to wear my regular ones. Second day I'm wearing other coat. I'm called to the supervisor's office, one step lower than the principal, because of my lack of coat, along with two dudes who weren't wearing this for who knows why point. The supervisor starts rambling on and on about me not wearing the coat, and if I keep doing I can't come to class, and asks why I'm not using. I tell her that I lost mine, and there were none in the LOF. She then asks me why I didn't buy another one, and I tell her lack of money and how bad stuff are with my mom. And since I was on a roll in the last one, I didn't shut my yaps. I kept talking, telling how stupid the rule is, and how I'm not using anymore the school coat, and if they wanted it so badly, then they should buy me a coat, and to every other student without one. They didn't take it too well point, but since there were two more dudes there, they couldn't shove it under the carpet what I said, and simply ignore it. I had then in, if you want me to attend classes with the school coat, and not with my coat, you will have to give me one. Else, you don't want me attending classes. The dudes were shown to the exit, and I was alone. They just called my mom, and told her to pick me up, because of my dress code point. Next day, word got out. Lots of students showed up without the coats and walked themselves to the principal's office. In less than 1 week we could use the coat we wanted. Less a rule than the enforcement of a rule, but when the General Leonard Chapman took over as Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service he was appalled to learn of the lax enforcement of border controls, so naturally he leaned on his background as Marine Corps General and whipped the department into shape. Point mind you, he didn't much care about immigration. He didn't think they were evil or monstrous or anything. He was more of an Inspector Javert. The law is the law and the law is not mock type. The law said the border should be closed, so he tried to close it. Problem is, that had the opposite effect point. While before 72 there was a small undocumented population, mostly in border states, they were temporary. 16-year-old kids, carrying 20 pounds of fresh fruit across the border, selling it at a roadside stand, and then heading home before the end of the day. No need to stick around. It was expensive to live in America, and they were just there to sell some fruit. America got cheap fruit, and Mexico got $10, but once you start making it harder and harder to cross the border, well, now you've incentivized them stick around for a while, since it's hard to cross, and harder to get back. Point. Since 1986 the US has spent $35 billion on border enforcement, and at the same time our undocumented population has more than doubled. I know that this is not the question asked, but I'd like to contribute a story of an odd rule that worked spectacularly well. I worked for a few years at a restaurant/bar/music venue. Things were constantly happening, and many of those things were problems for the front of house staff, the kitchen crew, and the management, dealing with huge crowds, helping bands set up their equipment, and making sure they got a meal before performing, handling wasted people who wanted to drive, calming down elderly customers who were unhappy about everything, stopping drunkards from getting creepy with the younger waitstaff, generally halting sexist assholes, etc. Due to this hectic environment, in which everyone had multiple jobs, someone was always having a meltdown, and simultaneously someone else was having the time of their life at the same moment. The fluctuating tension needed a solution, and this is where the boss stepped up and got creative with problem solving. Point. The boss lived above the restaurant, and whenever he noticed that an employee was stressed out, or sad or otherwise having a tough time, he would literally shout, "You need a goddamn attitude adjustment." To the customers this sounded like a scolding, but to those of us on staff this was secret code for, "You need a break. Go into my bedroom, help yourself to as much marijuana as you need, and come back down when you're ready." As a bartender, this was such a gift. Sometimes I wouldn't even smoke. I'd just take 10 minutes to be by myself. But usually I'd get super stoned and step back behind the bar with my eyes glazed and my mind racing a mile a minute. It was perfect. Much better than staff drinks. The best was when 2 or 3 of us got an attitude adjustment together. This practice helped many of us. and those that didn't smoke were encouraged to take 10-minute breaks whenever they needed a timeout. Working at a busy restaurant, bar, and venue can be very hard work. These breaks made all the difference. My employer moved our island of misfit toys of a tech support team from their own building into the company headquarters. At the same time, the person in charge of our department, our boss's boss, changed, since he was in charge of a related department in the same building. The first rules included, no personal items on the desk. The second was pants must be slacks, all shirts must have collars, or contain the company logo. He was treating the tech support staff as though they had to interact with customers in person. About 3 weeks went by before the first personal items started to appear. Our new department head went to our boss to complain. An email went out reiterating that we couldn't have personal items. At which point, a few of us just started documenting the personal items on the desks of the other related department that he was in charge of. Photos were taken, inventory was listed. This ended up going 2 hours. Who basically said what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We were allowed everything back, except our Nerf guns and Nerf stress balls, at least for throwing, and ours ruled we only needed to adhere to the company dress code, which said closed-toed shoes and wear appropriate for your job. Needless, a new boss wasn't our boss after about 3 months and retired about a year later. At one of my job, the boss would always give us a paper copy of our schedule for next week, and for people who always had the exact same schedule every single week, he would kindly tell us that he had to make change to the schedule and make sure to check it out. Sometime, he even asked us permission to make changes before doing so. Fast forward 10 months later, boss quit because his superior decided he was a piece of shit. New boss was a total beach, but at least kept the same way of handling schedules for about 2 weeks. For a month, all was good, but she decided that she didn't have to tell people when she changed the schedule. Well, it happened to me. I usually worked between 12 PM to 9 PM on Thursday, so I decided to have a little morning shopping that day. I arrive at 11:50 AM with all my stuff. My boss is pissed because I was 3 hours late. I told her, but I always starts at noon on Thursday. She said, not this week. Haven't you checked your schedule? I replied, I admit, no. But since I've had the same schedule for the last 7 months, you should have warned me that you made the change. Changing my schedule like that without telling me is not cool. When we changed bosses, we lost like 80% of our staff, and she had to replace them quickly. She ended up hiring a guy that lasted 3 weeks because he was caught stealing. Not sure if this applies, but this policy didn't really improve the customer experience. IMHO. I used to work at the PCC grocery store in Seattle. When you were in the check stand, they would time your items per minute, and the store manager would post a bar chart in the break room so the employees would see how they compared to one another, and there would be a personal message from the store manager saying that the people with the lowest scores could start looking for work at Walmart. So this is how checkers would deal with the situation. The clock started once you scanned or rang the first item. It would pause if you hit subtotal on the register, start again when scanning/ringing commenced, and stopped when subtotal was hit again. So checkers would stage the customer's groceries and then scan items individually and rapidly as possible. Ringing 12 of an item would count as one item, so it was better to rapidly scan each item. The top checker, Dawn, had it down. She would fling things across the scanner. Sometimes they would fly off the counter and a bagger clerk would retrieve them from the floor. Once she hit the subtotal button, the clock would stop and she would go into second gear and have a relaxing conversation with the customer. I don't think she actually checked people out any faster than the rest of us. My high school came up with this new dress code rule that basically banned odd socks or any socks that weren't plain black ones. The trouble is they hadn't amended the letters they had sent out with the dress code. Socks had always just been a non-issue, unlike shoes, and nobody had ever been told off for wearing odd or colorful socks. So I show up to school with perfect uniform except these odd socks. I line up with the other kids and I'm stopped from entering the school. I didn't have a cell phone and asked to use the office to call my parents and was told no. The teachers also told me that I had to come back to school after changing my socks, even though I clearly stated that I already purchased my return ticket and didn't have money for another trip. So I left and catch the bus home. On my way back I stopped at a payphone just to tell my dad, and he doesn't believe that I was sent home due to my socks. Once I explain it to him, he starts fuming and calls up the school office, asking them why they didn't notify parents that their children had essentially just been chucked out, and some probably had no way of getting home until the end of the day. Anyway, I didn't get told off about my socks for the rest of my time at the school, and as far as I know nobody else did either. What if humanity talk openly about what we pretty much all agree on by now? No one alive knows for a certainty where we came from or why. We are a naturally curious and innovative animal. We are intrigued by the concept of life and death, born with existential questions. We have progressed as a species far enough to know we exist on a tiny orb in a universe far more vast than our brains even have the capacity to imagine. Said universe is for us intensely hostile, but, by some astronomical stroke of luck, we have the opportunity to exist here. To live. We know Earth has an expiry date, although we all may disagree on what that date is. We know we spend a tiny amount of money on science to understand what we are compared to what we spend on military, disagreeing and killing each other. We all want our loved ones safe and the best possible future for generations to come. None of us seem too happy about where humanity is headed. We are not, as humans, talking about this. Why can we not hit pause for a moment, think, then have a conversation about this? Do we not owe it to all the generations that led up to us and all the generations to come to sit down and be reasonable people? Is it too big a subject, or are we simply distracted by the society we happen to be born into? Is there even a chance that we can agree on something bigger that's more important than personal gain? What if the way to change the world is to shift the collective minds to focus on bigger things than individual success? We can read an article that says, a huge asteroid approaches Earth, August 29th, 2018, without making much of a fuss about it. That seems disconnected to me. What will it take for us to take our own existence seriously? If we don't manage to unite as a species and work together on the one planet we have, we are basically waiting for our own extinction, and sort of just fine with it. Casually buying sheet produced under horrifying conditions whilst patting ourselves on the shoulder for donating $1 to climate support, only when in a good mood, and happen to have some spare change. Without changing the way the world is viewed, we know we are more or less faked. This should be a big issue, but nobody seems interested in talking about it. What use is it to have been alive if we roll the dice on our own legacy whilst also knowing we had an honest chance to actively make it better, safer and more fair for everyone, not just ourselves and our closest circle? Why can't we see the great value in that? Imagine if we tried to preserve our species, literally, as long as humanly possible. Is that not a worthier goal than owning the most stuff when you die? Shouldn't we want to have these conversations? Shouldn't we be given the opportunity to be curious about our origins without feeling the need to kill people for disagreeing? Aren't we tired of being pushed into a mold to fit a society that takes its inhabitants' existence for granted? Just a thought. My old job at a fishing resort, the boss insisted that all the aluminum boats 12-14 feet had to be hand sponged and dry all the time. It made sense, since you wanted customers to have nice clean dry boats up until it actually rained, and my boss expected me to be out on the docks in the rain sponging out boats constantly in case customers want to go fishing. Told my boss I can just throw in the electric pump for 60 seconds and have it emptied and ready in under 2 minutes if they want to go out, so I could do more productive stuff. Needless to say, I was still out there sponging hand cleaning boats. This included ones we didn't have rented in case someone wanted to rent one. Instead of investing in electric pumps that self-empty the boats when it rains, we had to do it all by hand. So you can only imagine getting to work after a huge rainstorm and you have 12 to 13 boats almost submerged because we didn't have covers or automatic pumps in the boats, since the boss didn't want to spend any money they didn't have to point more than once the boats were 1 inch or less from being fully submerged in the water, and the only thing keeping them out was being tied so close to the dock that the side tied down couldn't go any lower since the dock was holding it above water. Another rule was we had a gas pump at the docks, obviously to fill up boats. Well, if someone wanted to pay in cash they had to go all the way up a hill like 200 to 300 feet to get to the main office. To pay for it, we weren't allowed to just take the person's $15 and then take it up ourselves after they left. We had to send the customer up to the office themselves to pay for it. Apparently the boss was paranoid that we might pocket the money or something, since people had done that in the past from stories I was told. Understandable, but it's a huge pain in the ass for the customer, especially if they're older. Regardless, I usually took the money up myself and disregarded that rule. Wasn't about to make customers walk up a hill 200 plus FT to pay $10 for gas when they could just hand me the bill instead. Boss would have me run the till when they weren't in the office, but didn't trust us to handle the gas money, which made no sense, which is why I just disregarded that rule. Never got in trouble for it either, and when they would bring it up I would be like, you expect me to tell the customer to walk all the way up here to give you $10 when they could just give it to me instead, and I bring it up here when I walk by. The United States welfare reform called for work for welfare rules that were supposed to encourage welfare recipients to get work. Notably, most people able to work and without young children to care for and who lived in an area where work was available were required to work at least part-time in order to receive benefits like food stamps. While in principle the program was a good idea, the ongoing results were very negative. Objectively, these reforms did decrease the number of people on welfare, at least for a time. However, the US poverty rate continued to stagnate, while the cost of these programs actually increased. My interpretation of this is that there was no incentive for low-paying jobs to increase with inflation, since the US government was now effectively subsidizing basic living expenses, such as food. Indeed, while welfare reform does require food stamps recipients to work, today there are nearly twice as many recipients as in 1994, despite a slightly higher unemployment rate. If the majority of those currently on food stamps are also working, then it should be assumed that their jobs do not pay adequately to enough to feed their families. Indeed, the maximum net income to receive food stamps is 100% the poverty level, so this strongly suggests that this is the case. Welfare reform is an example of massive backfire because it failed to achieve its goals and eventually dramatically increased the number of welfare participants by removing competition from the low-paying job market. I worked at this little general store that was right down the street from my house, and if you were not going to make it to work you have to call at least 2 hours prior to not showing up. There was also a strict policy that if you no-called no-show you would get a strike, and if you got 3 strikes you'd get fired. Well, within the first 2 months of working there I just went on vacation with my family during the 4th of July and didn't tell anyone that I was doing it. And I was scheduled to work that day, so it was even worse for me. I got written up for it, of course, but I kept working there. Even though I did that, my boss, who was an Italian woman in her early 40s, started to take a liking to me. Mostly because anytime she asked me to work I would come in, even if I wasn't scheduled. I think she also liked that I was Italian and that I was really nice to all of the customers. Long story short, there were multiple times that I just slept in by accident when I was supposed to be at work. My boss would always call me and ask me where I was, and I would just tell her THT I would be right down, because it only took me about 3 minutes to walk to work. If any of the other employees did that, she would get pissed. But she never wrote me up again after the first time, and I ended up working there for 3 years. Haha.